بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه التابعين له بإحسان إلى بعد. Welcome back to another lesson on Waraqat of Imam al-Juwayni. You will remember from last week we took a look at this chart. This is the categorization of the topics in Usul Fiqh by Imam al-Ghazali. Okay, so this is the categorization of Imam al-Ghazali of these of the topics of Usul al-Fiqh. Today we want to take a little bit of a closer look, particularly at the topic of categories of evidence, or adilla. And adilla is plural of dalil. Dalil meaning evidence. So in terms of looking at the categories of evidence, or adilla, you will recall from our previous discussion that there are adilla that are agreed upon, and then there are adilla that are disputed. It's worth noting that in the categorization that Imam al-Ghazali actually uses in al-Mustasfa, he actually speaks about valid evidences and invalid evidences, adilla mawhuma. But this categorization of agreed upon and muttafaq alayha and disputed mukhtalaf fiha becomes relatively standard after him. You'll note here that he's mentioned al-kitab, al-sunnah, al-ijma' and al-istishab. And then amongst the disputed evidences, you have shar'u min qablana, Qawl al-Sahabi, al-Istihsan, and Istislah. All of these are for Imam al-Ghazali. All of these are adilla mawhuma, meaning they're invalid evidences. They're believed by some usuliyin, by some scholars, to be evidences when they're in fact not valid evidences. Now, if you look at this chart here, you'll notice that there is a little bit of a difference. For starters, I've listed Qiyas. You recall from our previous discussion that Imam al-Ghazali discusses Qiyas under Qawaid al-Istinbat. He discusses Qiyas amongst the principles or the methods for deducing rulings from evidence. And so he treats it as a type of legal meanings or extra textual meanings that are still being drawn from the rulings of the texts. So they're being drawn from the kitab and from the sunnah. So this is why he has encountered it amongst the evidences. But we have chosen here to count it as an evidence. So Imam al-Ghazali is not actually questioning the validity or the authority of Qiyas. In fact, if you read al-Mustasfa, you will find that his argument for Qiyas is that Qiyas is a matter of ijma'. It's a matter of ijma' amongst the Sahaba. And so, clearly he's not questioning the authority of Qiyas, but rather he treats it as a method for deriving rulings from the Qur'an and Sunnah rather than listing it as a dalil on its own. But this does raise the question, is Qiyas agreed upon? Obviously, according to Imam al-Ghazali, at the very least, it is agreed upon by the companions. It is agreed upon by the companions. After all, this was his evidence that for its Hujjiyah. This is the main evidence that he produces for its Hujjiyah, is that it is a point of ijma' amongst the If we accept that this is the case, that it is ijma amongst the Sahaba, you still have, and I'm sure you're well aware of this, there is a famous khilaf with the Zahiris. The scholars of the Zahiri school, the followers of Dawood al-Zahiri, and obviously amongst the most famous of the Zahiri scholars being Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm, عليه rahmatullah, they reject the authority of Qiyas. They reject Qiyas as a valid form of evidence. So, yet despite that, you will find that many scholars, when speaking about, in their books on usul fiqh, they will speak about Qiyas as an agreed upon evidence. And there's a number of ways of looking at this. One is that, as Imam al-Ghazali has argued, there is an ijma' on Qiyas. There's an ijma' on Qiyas starting from the time of the Sahaba. And so the rejection of Qiyas does not appear until later, until the time of Dawood al-Zahiri or some other scholars who rejected Qiyas. So according to this perspective, and it's not our purpose here right now at the moment to adjudicate this difference, to decide, you know, who was right. But if we accept that there is an ijma' on this, and the khilaf is later, then this khilaf is an invalid khilaf because it's going against ijma', which we have yet to discuss. Is ijma' a hujjah or not? But again, you know, let's agree for the sake of argument for right now that ijma' is a hujjah. And so if ijma' is a hujjah, and ijma' is the evidence that qiyas is a hujjah, and this ijma' proceeds from well before Dawood al-Zahiri or anyone else who might have rejected qiyas, and is well established before him, then his ikhtilaf on this is not valid. Furthermore, it's worth noting, since we are reading the Waraqat of Imam al-Juwayni. Imam al-Juwayni in particular has a very harsh assessment of the Zahiri school and the scholars of the Zahiri school. And there is an ikhtilaf amongst the fuqaha and the usuliyin whether or not the ikhtilaf of the Zahiris is considered valid or not in any issue, in any fiqh issue. Are they considered amongst the fuqaha, amongst the mujtahideen, whose opinion has weight in fiqh disputes? And again, it's not my purpose here to pass judgment on this particular issue, this particular discussion. But Imam al-Juwayni is of the opinion that because qiyas, looking at the meanings that underlie the rulings, is such an essential component of fiqh, anyone who rejects qiyas is not a faqih aslan. He's not a faqih to begin with. And so therefore, their khilaf is not of any value. So that's another way of looking at why many of the usuliyin would have counted ijma' as, why many usuliyin would have counted qiyas as an evidence that is agreed upon. Now I want to look at, just briefly, just a glimpse at some of these evidences that are considered to be disputed. You'll note that Amal Ahl al-Madinah in particular is in red. The reason Amal Ahl al-Madinah is in red is because this is something that we've added. It wasn't in the original list. You'll find that this chart that we gave, Amal Ahl al-Madinah is nowhere mentioned. And we'll come to that in a moment. But just going down this list, first we have opinions of companions, or Qawl al-Sahabi. According to some usuliyin, and this is the famous view for the Hanafi school, Maliki school, and the Hanbali school, is that Qawl al-Sahabi is a hujjah when you have an opinion of a Sahabi on a fiqh issue, and there is no known opponent on this issue. There's no known opposing opinion on this issue from any other Sahabi. In this condition, according to a group of the usuliyin, Qawl al-Sahabi is a hujjah. And the famous view of the Shafi'is is that it is not a hujjah. Again, it is not our purpose here to give decisive conclusions on these topics, but just to give you a perspective on these discussions, where they come from and how they came about. So, for starters, if we look at the idea of Qawl al-Sahabi, or the Hujjiyah of Qawl al-Sahabi, a question that merits asking is, when did this idea come about? Did the companions see themselves, their own opinions, or opinions of other companions, as being hujjah? So, for example, did the companion say, well, I'm Abu Bakr, what I say is hujjah, or I'm Ibn Abbas, I'm a faqih of the Sahaba, what I say is hujjah, or were some companions looking at other companions as hujjah? So, for example, the Prophet ﷺ said, "Alaykum bi sunnati sunnati al-khulafa ar-rashidin al-mahdiyyin min ba'di." Hold on to my sunnah and the sunnah of the rightly guided khalifas after me. And in hindsight, we know that this is referring to Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali radiallahu anhum ajma'in, and some scholars add Hassan bin Ali radiallahu anhuma, because he was Khalifa for a few months. And it said that either these four or these five, that these are al-Khulafa al-Rashidin. So were the companions looking at these particular companions and saying, well, maybe these companions, their qawl is hujjah, their qawl is a dalil in the religion? Or do we find that the Khalifa would give an opinion, Abu Bakr or Umar or Uthman or Ali would give an opinion, and other companions would disagree? Obviously, I think it's safe to say that we find is the latter. They didn't treat the opinions of the Khulafa as binding opinions, or as binding evidence, I should say. So, when exactly does this idea appear? If it's not in the time of the Sahaba, then is it in the time of the Tabi'in? This is a question that merits investigation. It's not my purpose here to answer this question, only to give you food for thought. So, if this is the case, that that perhaps some of the companions were treating opinions of other companions as being a hujjah or a dalil, when exactly did this happen? How did this come about? And if so, under what conditions? Is it that this idea that we have of qawl al-Sahabi, إذا لم يعلم منه مخالف, as is mentioned by the later usuliyin, or that is developed later on by the usuliyin? This is the shart, that qawl al-Sahabi إذا لم يعلم منه مخالف كان حجة, that if you have an opinion of a solitary companion that is not opposed by any other companion, then this is a binding hujjah, this is a binding evidence. Is this, if we say for the sake of argument that this happened in the time of the Sahaba, is this how they understood it, or did they have some other understanding of it? Or if it wasn't them, then when? Was it in the time of the Tabi'in? Did this idea develop amongst the Tabi'in? If so, how? It's a question that merits exploration. Furthermore, we can ask, is there rational evidence for the Qawl of Sahabi being Hujjah, or is there textual evidence that Qawl of Sahabi, opinion of a companion, can be Hujjah? I've already mentioned one hadith, alaykum bi sunnati wa sunnati al-khulafa ar-rashidin al-mahdiyyin min ba'di. That doesn't apply to all of the companions. It applies to 4 of the companions, or 5 of the companions, as we said. If we take it to be an evidence for this principle, and so it would merit investigation. Those who say that Qawl of Sahabi is a Hujjah, do they use this hadith as one of their evidences? If they do use this hadith as one of their evidences, how have they interpreted this hadith? How have those scholars who reject Hujjiyat Qawl of Sahabi, how have they responded to this evidence? And likewise with other evidences, so other hadiths that might be quoted or ayat that might be quoted, how have they understood them? How have others responded to them, or how possibly can we respond to them? So the discussion here on this issue is twofold. One is an investigation of the historical development of this concept, Hujjiyat Qawl al-Sahabi. How does it come about? When did it come about? And at whose hands did it come about? And in which form? And what were its conditions? And how accurately is this reflected then in the discussion of the books of Usul al-Fiqh as they are formulated some centuries later? Some centuries later, meaning some centuries after the Sahaba. And the second aspect of this discussion is the theoretical aspect. It's the theoretical discussion of the evidences that are used to support the idea that Qawl al-Sahabi is Hujjah, or evidences that are given that Qawl al-Sahabi cannot be a Hujjah. Likewise, responses to those evidences. So this then is a theoretical discussion. So there's an historical aspect of this discussion, and there's a theoretical aspect of this discussion. Moving on to the next disputed evidence, we have Istihsan. The dispute concerning Istihsan is very early. It goes back to a very early stage. In fact, we have from Imam Shafi'i. Imam Shafi'i has dealt with this issue of Istihsan, with this topic of Istihsan, extensively. He rebuts the usage of Istihsan in his famous al-Risala. Al-Risala, of course, as you know, is his famous work on Usul Fiqh. And he also dedicated a short treatise to the topic entitled Ibtal al-Istihsan. This is also found in Kitab Kitab as it's published. It's a compilation of the writings of Imam Shafi'i. So one of the Risa'il that he wrote, Ibtal al-Istihsan, is dedicated to establishing that Istihsan is not Hujjah. This work, along with Imam Shafi'i's other writings, particularly al-Risala and Ibtal al-Istihsan. Ibtal al-Istihsan is very interesting because it shows very clearly Imam Shafi'i was very interested in the question of what constitutes valid evidence and what does not, and how do we derive those evidences? Meaning, how do we derive the authority of those evidences? How do we establish that this particular type of evidence is in fact Hujjah? It's a very pressing question for Imam Shafi'i, and this concern of his is very clearly reflected in his Ibtal al-Istihsan. Inshallah, I'm hopeful that one day, in the not too distant future, um, when we do some of our more advanced lessons on usul, that we'll actually have opportunity to study al-Risala of Imam Shafi'i, as well as his other writings, such as Ibtal al-Istihsan and Jima' al-Ilm, that deal with usul fiqh. So Imam Shafi'i then rebuts Istihsan. And Istihsan is something that, in particular, the Hanafi school is famous for its championing Istihsan. And Istihsan, there's some confusion or dispute concerning what exactly is Istihsan. How do we define Istihsan? Which I'll get to in a moment. But most famous, the school that is most famous for its use of Istihsan is the Hanafi school, followed by the Maliki school. It's reported from Imam Malik that he said, "Tis'atu ashar al-fiqh al-istihsan." 9/10 of fiqh is istihsan. It's also interesting. It's worth noting that Imam Shafi'i, in his book Ibtal al-Istihsan, while I think he did have the Hanafi use of istihsan in mind when discussing the authority of istihsan, in Ibtal al-Istihsan, the particular case studies that he deals with, as case studies of the usage of istihsan to derive a fiqhi ruling, are actually Maliki examples. And this is possibly a reflection of the fact that he must have written Ibtal al-Istihsan in Egypt. And for those of you who are familiar with Imam Shafi'i's life and the stages that he went through, the last few years of his life were spent in Egypt. And in Egypt, he had a good bit of rivalry and debate going on with the Maliki scholars of Egypt, or some of the Maliki scholars in Egypt. And so it seems that Ibtal al-Istihsan was actually written in this context, which would explain why it focuses on the case studies that it analyzes to break down the usage of Istihsan are actually Maliki ones. So the Malikis are also known for Istihsan, although there's some ikhtilaf amongst Maliki usuliyin about whether Istihsan is Hujjiyah. But it's relatively famous that Imam Malik uses Istihsan. And there's this famous quote from him. Even Imam Ahmad, the scholars of the Hanbali school, differ on whether or not Istihsan is valid. And that goes back in part to some quotes of Imam Ahmad where he's asked about a particular issue. And he says, yes, on this issue, I'm of such and such view. And so his student asks him, but doesn't this go against Qiyas? And so Imam Ahmad says, al-Qiyasu kada, lakinni istihsant. Meaning the ruling that is dictated by Qiyas in this case would be such and such. But in this case, I've done istihsan. So some of them, based on this, say that Imam Ahmad, so some of the Hanabila, they accept istihsan and others don't. So it's something that is somewhat contentious. Now, in spite of the very considerable dispute that exists concerning istihsan, many later usuliyin have said this khilaf is basically lafzi. Why? Because istihsan has been defined by some as العدول عن دليل إلى دليل آخر لموجب. Basically, it is departing from one evidence in favor of another evidence for some compelling reason that the jurist, the mujtahid, feels makes this evidence more compelling, it makes it stronger in this particular case. And so if istihsan is understood in this fashion, then the reality is that all fuqaha do this. There is no faqih except that at some point or another he looks at one evidence, and this evidence might even seem to be the most apparently relevant evidence to this particular issue, whether it's qiyas or it's a text or something. This might seem that this text is clearly the most relevant text to this particular issue, or this qiyas is clearly the obvious qiyas that is pertinent to this issue, but the faqih might feel that another text in this case, or another evidence in this case, or another qiyas in this case is stronger. This is something that all fuqaha do. And so if this is the definition of istihsan, then yes, istihsan basically it's just khilaf is just lafzi. And there is no real khilaf concerning istihsan. But before we can reach conclusions on this issue, it's important, and similar and other issues that are issues of considerable dispute, it's very important that you have a proper conception of them, and to understand how different definitions or different conceptions of a particular topic might be driving certain discussions. So, for example, this is one definition of istihsan, but there are other definitions of istihsan. There are other definitions of istihsan. So, for example, some have defined istihsan as دليل ينقدح في نفس المجتهد لا يستطيع التعبير عنه. It is a dalil, an evidence, or a legal argument that comes to the mind of the mujtahid. It's an idea. It's in his it's in his mind, but he's incapable of expressing it. And so this particular conception of istihsan, a lot of the usuliyin, you will find, have taken considerable exception to it. That what is this? How can something that you can't express, if it's a valid evidence, you should be able to put it into words. Now, to be fair, this idea of an evidence that or an argument that the mujtahid is unable to put into words, if we look at it sort of from a, I guess you could say, psychological perspective, there is actually some truth to this. Sometimes on thinking over an issue, you will start to develop certain ideas, and sometimes you might not find the words to capture the idea that is in your head. This does happen. So it's not something that is altogether baseless, but I think it's fair to say that clearly that something like that would not be admissible in a legal dispute, in a debate amongst scholars. You can't just say, well, I feel this way and I can't tell you why. Obviously that's not admissible as an evidence in a legal dispute. But some have defined istihsan in this way. So obviously, this is, you can see how this definition would lead to a very different conclusion concerning istihsan from the other definition that we talked about. But with all of that said, the most important question concerning istihsan, or I think the most important question that we have to start with figuring out the status of istihsan, is the historical element once again. What exactly is istihsan as it was used by Imam Abu Hanifa and likewise also, of course, Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani and Abu Yusuf? What was istihsan as they conceived of it? And istihsan oftentimes is particularly, so we saw this definition of istihsan as leaving one dalil for another. Istihsan is particularly, historically, was actually associated with qiyas. So you will have in a given rule, in a given issue, you will have a ruling that is the an apparent ruling that is dictated by Qiyas, by legal analogy. That the Qiyas on this issue dictates that the conclusion must be such and such. And Istihsan then is a departure from Qiyas. So if we think of Istihsan as departure from Qiyas, this is now something that is narrower than the first definition of Istihsan that we mentioned, which is simply udul and dalil, which is departure from one evidence to another. Here we're speaking specifically of a departure from Qiyas. And we can't really get into this issue because it's beyond the scope of our purpose here in this class. But this is related to the controversy that existed in the early generations, and it was a controversy in the sense that it was very contentious. It was a very contentious dispute between the Ahlul Hadith and the Ahlul Ra'i in terms of what exactly is the role of Ra'i. To what extent is the independent reasoning of the scholar, the faqih, the jurist, what role does it have in deriving rulings? And so Ahlul Ra'i, of course, in Iraq are particularly known for their usage of Qiyas. They're known for their usage of Qiyas. And along with Qiyas, they also use Istihsan. So they're already being criticized by the Ahlul Hadith that you use Qiyas too broadly. And what exactly that means, again, is beyond the scope of our discussion, I think. But you're using Qiyas too broadly, and then you're making exceptions to this Qiyas that we already object that you're using it in the fashion that you're using it. You are now making Istihsan. You yourself are then leaving that Qiyas. So what is this methodology that you're using? So this created a lot of dispute between these two camps. So the most important aspect, I think, or the most important starting point to try and get to the bottom of this discussion is the historical aspect. And so recently, Hassan al-Shahawi, he's a Muslim researcher, but he studying in a Western university, did his PhD thesis on Istihsan in Kitab al-Asl of Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani. Who is, of course, as you know, the student of Abu Hanifa. And so he surveys the usage of Istihsan across the issues of Kitab al-Asl. He gathers together the places where Istihsan has been used and analyzes what exactly is going on here. This sort of study is critical, and I was actually, before this study had come out, I was actually hoping that someone would do this sort of study, because it is critical in understanding what exactly was Istihsan for the early Hanafis, and why did it elicit such a strong response from Imam Shafi'i and other scholars, and how does that then relate to the theoretical discussions that develop later on in the books of Usul Fiqh. So if anyone is interested in reading up more on this topic, I would recommend to start with this thesis of Dr. Hassan al-Shahawi, and inshallah I will share it in the group for those who are interested. The next topic that we have is Amal Ahl al-Madinah, or as it's sometimes known, Ijma Ahl al-Madinah. We saw that Imam al-Ghazali didn't list it. He didn't list it amongst al-Adilla al-Mukhtalaf fiha. And the reason is because in the books of Usul Fiqh, and I believe this is the case in al-Mustasfa as well. Yes, yeah, that's right, in al-Mustasfa as well. Typically, this issue of Amal Ahl al-Madinah, or Ijma' Ahl al-Madinah, as it's oftentimes framed, is oftentimes mentioned as a subcategory of Ijma'. It's not mentioned as an issue on its own. And this is important because if we dig a little bit deeper into the discussions on Amal Ahl al-Madinah, we find a couple of things. For starters, many of the discussions that exist in the books of Usul Fiqh concerning Amal Ahl al-Madinah are very brief. They're very brief. They mention it under Ijma' Ahl al-Madinah. If we dig a little bit deeper and look at some of the more detailed discussions, we find that Amal Ahl al-Madinah is not necessarily just a form of Ijma'. It's not simply just the idea that the consensus of the people of Medina. Because many scholars, the way that they dealt with this issue, they said that, well, consensus requires consensus of all of the jurists. Ahl al-Madinah are not all of the jurists. So therefore, their ijma' is not a hujjah. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. Nothing more to discuss here. Nothing to see here. Just move along. But if you look a little bit deeper into the discussions on Amal Ahl al-Madinah, you will find that Amal Ahl al-Madinah is not limited to this. In fact, Maliki scholars themselves differ as to what is intended by Amal Ahl al-Madinah, what falls under Amal Ahl al-Madinah or Ijma' Ahl al-Madinah. What are the forms of it that are hujjah and what are the forms of it that are not hujjah? In Arabic, there is an important study titled Amal Ahl al-Madinah Bayna Mustalahat Malik wa Ara' al-Usuliyin. For those who are interested, I'll share this as well. This is an important study that attempts to study Malik's own usage of Amal Ahl al-Madinah and his different terminologies that his different terms that he uses that are relevant, where the author Dr. Ahmed Nur Saif has attempted to analyze how he's using Amal Ahl al-Madinah. In English, there's also a study you can refer to, Malik and Medina, Islamic Legal Reasoning in the Formative Period by Sheikh Omar Farouk Abdullah. He also has a discussion on Amal Ahl al-Madinah. I'm not certain, but I think it might actually be drawn, his discussion on the topic might actually be drawn from the study by Dr. Ahmed Nur Saif. And so this is then is another example of an issue that there's a need for historical investigation to get to the bottom of what exactly is Amal Ahl al-Madinah. Another aspect of the historical examination of Amal Ahl al-Madinah is Imam Shafi'i's critique of the Malikis and their use of Amal Ahl al-Madinah. And many of you will be aware that Imam Shafi'i is himself a direct student of Imam Malik. So this is also an important discussion concerning Imam Shafi'i's position on Amal Ahl al-Madinah. You can refer to al-Umm, particularly Kitab Ikhtilaf Malik wa Shafi'i, as well as other sections. And in English, you will find that there are some important references and discussions on this. And Dr. Ahmed al-Shamsi's very important book, The Canonization of Islamic Fiqh, or The Canonization of Islamic Law by Ahmed al-Shamsi. I'll share those as well on the group for those of you who are interested. But it's worth noting that with all of that, with all this khilaf that exists about Amal Ahl al-Madinah, and it's a very contentious issue, yet we have that, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, he argues that there are some specific forms of Amal Ahl al-Madinah that are actually accepted by all scholars. And if you do a little bit of digging, you will find that, in fact, there are non-Maliki scholars who have said that some forms of Amal Ahl al-Madinah are accepted as a hujjah. And finally, coming to the last issue here, Maslaha Mursala. Maslaha Mursala. Maslaha Mursala, or the process of Istislah, is it was listed by Imam al-Ghazali as an invalid evidence, and it is frequently mentioned as a disputed evidence. many usul works present this principle or this evidence, this dalil of Maslaha Mursala as something that is unique to Malik, but rejected by the other imams. So this is one presentation of this issue. Some scholars actually say that they actually categorize Maslaha Mursala under Qiyas as a sort of type of Qiyas. So here we have, some of them are saying that it is disputed evidence. Some of them are saying it's a disputed evidence that is only accepted by Malik. Some of them are saying it's a form of Qiyas. And then you have some scholars saying that in reality, all jurists make use of Maslaha Mursala. And so, for example, Imam al-Qarrafi says that in reality, all of the fuqaha use it. Ibn Daqiq al-Eid says all the fuqaha actually use it. And both of them, incidentally, Qarrafi is a Maliki, and Ibn Daqiq al-Eid was a Maliki who became a Shafi'i. Ibn Daqiq al-Eid is a particularly interesting scholar because of his fame as an expert in usul fiqh, and because he's a very unique example of a scholar who was recognized by the scholars of his own time to be an authority in not one, but two madhabs. So he started off as a Maliki and then became a Shafi'i, but he was recognized as an authority of the Maliki madhab by the Maliki scholars in his time, and he was recognized as an authority in the Shafi'i madhab by the Shafi'i scholars in his time. This is something very unique. And he says that the reality is that all jurists actually use, all of them actually use Maslaha Mursala. Malik is used the most, followed by Ahmed and the Hanafis, then Hanafis, and Shafi is the least. But all of them use Maslaha Mursala. And this is someone who was a Maliki, so who's clearly very familiar with Maslaha Mursala, was an authority in the Maliki madhab, and now he's a Shafi and considered an authority in the Shafi madhab. So we have, some scholars are saying that only Malik uses Maslaha Mursala. Some scholars are saying all of them actually agree on the use of Maslaha Mursala, and all claims otherwise are in fact incorrect. And some of them saying that Maslaha Mursala is in fact not a separate dalil, it belongs under Qiyas. So if we look at these three issues, Istihsan, Amal Ahl al-Madinah, and Maslaha Mursala, these are examples of topics in which you will find there are these well-known disputes. Yet also there are claims of agreement at the same time. Or, as we saw in the case of Istihsan, there is the claim that the difference of opinion is simply semantic. It's khilaf lafzi. All of these issues are also examples of issues where there's considerable scope to expand on the treatment of these topics in the classical usul works. In fact, there have been some important studies on these topics by modern scholars, and I gave some examples of that. And the reality is that there is still scope for further investigation and further discussion on these topics. So, for example, Dr. Shahawi's study on Istihsan could be seen as an excellent starting place for further discussions for examining subsequent discussions on Istihsan post Muhammad ibn Hassan, the response of Imam Shafi, etc., so on and so forth. Okay, so if you look at Imam al-Haramain's al-Waraqat, Imam al-Haramain has, after giving sort of his overview of the topics of usul al-fiqh, he's jumped straight into aqsam al-kalam, categories of speech, and then other topics that basically deal with textual interpretation. So in other words, he's saying, or in other words, what he's basically done is he's taken the idea that the Quran and Sunnah are Hujjah, he's sort of taken them for granted. And essentially, this is fine if we consider that the status of the Quran and Sunnah and the Hujjiyah of the Quran and Sunnah is indisputable. The status in the religion is indisputable. And considering that this is a very short text, this is a natural approach for him to take, that he simply has skipped over discussion on the Hujjiyah of the Quran, the Hujjiyah of Sunnah, to jump straight to textual interpretation. Because textual interpretation applies first and foremost to the text of the Quran and Sunnah. The purpose of all the discussions on textual interpretation and the principles of textual interpretation in the books of Usul Fiqh is to interpret the Quran and Sunnah. And so they follow from the belief that the Quran and Sunnah are in fact Hujjah. So while he has chosen not to really address this, I felt that it would be good for us to take a brief look at how we establish the Hujjiyah of the Quran and Sunnah, to get an idea of how we go about establishing that these are in fact Hujjah, to get a deeper look into how something is established as a dalil. So when it comes to establishing the authority of the Quran, first we have to prove the existence of God, the oneness of God, and the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, in reality, if we look at these, you could actually say that proving the last one, the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, proves the rest of them. Because if you look at Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the claim that he's making is that he received revelation, and that this revelation is divine revelation. And so if you find signs that what he is saying is true, then it naturally follows that God exists, that God is one, and that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his last and final messenger, and that his message and teaching is binding and obligatory to follow for all of mankind until the coming of the hour. But there are evidences, rational evidences for proving the existence of God. There are rational evidences then and arguments for proving that God must be one, Tawheed, and then rational evidences or for proving that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is in fact a prophet. Now, this doesn't mean that if someone has not done this, then that their iman is invalid. As long as someone believes in this, as long as someone believes that this is the truth and he has no doubt of it, his iman is valid. But in terms of establishing this, establishing that the Quran is in fact Hujjah, we have to establish that it is in fact from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is in fact from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so that requires going through this process. Otherwise, generally speaking, anyone who has been raised as a Muslim and has a sound fitrah and has not been exposed to things that will cause his iman to be weak, will generally not be affected by doubts and will not have a problem in recognizing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his oneness, and the truth of his revelation. And this is something that, oftentimes it's even something that it's very, there's an experiential element to it. There's an experiential element to iman, which is the signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us in our own lives. Signs that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shows us in our own lives. But when it comes to proving the prophethood of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the most important sign that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given him is the Qur'an. وَقَالُوا لَوْلَا أُنزِلَ عَلَيْهِ آيَاتٌ مِّن رَبِّهِ قُلْ إِنَّمَا الْآيَاتُ عِندَ اللَّهِ وَإِنَّمَا أَنَا نَذِيرٌ مُبِينٌ أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِهِمْ أَنَّا أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ يُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ إِنَّ فِي ذَلِكَ لَرَحْمَةً وَذِكْرَى لِقَوْمٍ يُؤْمِنُونَ. And they say, if only signs were sent down to him from his Lord. Say the signs are with Allah, meaning it's for Allah to send whatever sign he chooses. I'm nothing more than a clear warner to you. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala responds to their requests. أَوَلَمْ يَكْفِهِمْ أَنَّا أَنزَلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ يُتْلَى عَلَيْهِمْ. Is it not sufficient for them, and all the signs that they're asking for, to have the most obvious sign? Is it not sufficient for them that we have sent down to you al-Kitab, the book, and that it is being recited to them, it is read to them? So the greatest sign that the Prophet ﷺ was given was the Qur'an. The Prophet ﷺ states in hadith, مَا مِنَ الْأَنْبِيَاءِ نَبِيٌّ إِلَّا أُعْطِيَ مِنَ الْآيَاتِ مَا مِثْلُهُ أُؤْمِنَ أو آمن عليه البشر وإنما كان الذي أوتيته وحيا أوحاه الله إلي فأرجو أن أكون أكثرهم, or in this wording actually it says فأرجو أني أكثرهم تابعا يوم القيامة. Never has there been a prophet except that he was given such signs that mankind would believe in him on account of the signs that he was given. And this وإنما كان الذي أوتيته, that which I have been given, the sign that I have been given, is revelation that Allah has granted me. So I'm hopeful that I will have the most followers of all of the prophets on the day of resurrection. This hadith is reported by Bukhari and Muslim. This particular narration is actually from Sahih Bukhari, but it's reported by Bukhari and Muslim. And so what the Prophet ﷺ then is saying here is that this sign that he has been given is in reality the greatest of all the signs given to all the prophets, which is why he links him being the prophet with the most followers on the day of resurrection with this idea that every prophet was given a sign so that people would believe in him. So the sign that he has been given is the greatest sign. And as a result, he will have the most followers on the day of resurrection. Now, if we stop for a moment and examine the Qur'an, there's basically three possibilities. The first possibility is that the Qur'an is revelation as it claims, and its claim is true. The second possibility is that the Qur'an is forgery. So either it is claiming to be revelation and this is true, or this claim is false. If the claim is false, then the Qur'an could be a forgery, in which case it could have been forged by Muhammad himself or with help from others. And this is not, this accusation is something that's mentioned in the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَمْ يَقُولُونَ افْتَرَاهُ قُلْ فَأْتُوا بِعَشْرِ سُورٍ مِثْلِهِ مُفْتَرَيَاتٍ وَادْعُوا مَنِ اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. Do they say that he has fabricated it? Say to them, then bring 10 surahs like it, similarly forged, and call upon whomever you can other than Allah to help you if you're truly truthful in your claim that it is a forgery. In another verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Am yaquluna iftarah. Do they say that he has fabricated it? Say to them, Qul fa'tu bi suratin mithlihi. Bring a surah like the Quran, a single surah. وَادْعُوا مَنِ اسْتَطَعْتُم مِّن دُونِ اللَّهِ إِن كُنتُمْ صَادِقِينَ. And call on whoever you are able, whoever you can to assist you other than Allah, if you are truthful in your claim. And in Surah Al-Furqan, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala quotes the disbelievers saying, وَقَالَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِنْ هَذَا إِلَّا إِفْكٌ افْتَرَاهُ. The disbelievers say, this is nothing more than a fabrication that he has forged. وَأَعَانَهُ عَلَيْهِ قَوْمٌ آخَرُونَ. And others assisted him in that. Either he forged it himself or others helped him, but it's a forgery, it's a lie, it's false. And if it's not something that is a forgery by Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then it is ramblings of a madman. There's not a third possibility. And this is something mentioned in the Quran. وَيَقُولُونَ إِنَّا لَتَارِكُ آلِهَتِنَا لِشَاعِرٍ مَجْنُونٍ. Should we leave our gods? They say, should we leave our gods for the words, for the claim of a mad poet? Basically describing the Quran as being nothing more than poetry, but ultimately coming back to the idea that he's a madman. Likewise, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, كَذَلِكَ مَا أَتَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِهِمْ مِنْ رَسُولٍ إِلَّا قَالُوا سَاحِرٌ أَوْ مَجْنُونٌ. Likewise, there did not come any messenger to the people before them, except that they would say, he's a sorcerer, he's a madman. Again, coming back to the idea that either he's forging the Quran and it's nothing more than magical words, that is falsely claiming a revelation, or that he's a madman. Is this something that they basically bequeath to one another, that they advise one another that if a prophet comes to you that you should do this? The reality is, the reason that they kept this repeats is because there is no other possibilities. And so, because of their transgression and the rejection of the truth, when faced with the reality of revelation, again and again, they're left with no choice but to claim that the prophet that is sent to them, that is a madman or a liar. A madman or a liar. Anyone who reads the Quran knows clearly, without a doubt, that this is not possibly the ramblings of a madman. So that is completely out of the question. It's completely out of the question. The question then that remains is the Quran a forgery? Is the Quran a forgery? The Quran, if we look at the Quran firstly, we have the very powerful eloquence of the Quran. And this is basically what is known in Arabic as ijaz balaghi, or the linguistic miracle of the Quran, the rhetorical miracle of the Quran. And there are various scholars that have written about the ijaz of the Quran. Ijaz basically means ijaz or mu'jiz, oftentimes translated as miracle or miraculous. But particularly, what it means is that it was something that rendered ajz means to be incapable of something. So ijaz means to render someone incapable. So the Quran rendered mankind incapable of producing its like. It rendered the Quraysh incapable of producing a text like it, or a book like it, or a surah like it. This is ijaz. So there are different aspects of the Quran to look at. The first is the balagha of the Quran. Then we have the perfection of the Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَلَا يَتَدَبَّرُونَ الْقُرْآنَ لَوْ كَانَ مِنْ عِنْدِ غَيْرِ اللَّهِ لَوَجَدُوا فِيهِ اخْتِلَافًا كَثِيرًا. Do they not ponder the Quran? And this is an interesting verse, because the address here to ponder the Quran, to reflect on the Quran, is not even just for Muslims, it's for kuffar. Ponder the Quran, reflect on the Quran. If it was from other than Allah, you would find it filled with contradictions, inconsistencies, because such is the nature of human beings, and any product of a human being will be filled with imperfections and inconsistencies and contradictions. Also look at the perfection of the Quran's teachings, its content, with those of other scriptures, starting on the level of theology presented in the Quran, how he's understood how his nature and his attributes are presented in the Quran versus other religions. Look at the concept of prophethood in the Quran versus prophethood in the Bible, versus any sort of concept of prophethood or revelation in other religions. Consider its legal teachings, the laws that it's laid down, compare them with other legal codes. Look at its moral teachings, its ethical teachings, the ethical code that it lays down, and compare it with other ethical codes. Sheikh Darraz actually has an important book, Dastur al-Akhlaq in Quran. Basically examining the moral and ethical teachings of the Quran. And finally, not finally, but also consider this Quran with all of these characteristics that it has. Are we to believe that it is authored by an illiterate man from a people who were themselves illiterate and had no knowledge, no sciences, no literature, no scripture? Does that make sense? There are also, aside from the Quran, we have other signs of the Prophet's prophethood, starting with his various miracles that he performed. There are reports of his miracles, and there are many authentic reports of many of his miracles. Though that requires a discussion on hadith and the reliability of hadith and the methodology of hadithin. Then you have biblical prophecies. The Prophet ﷺ, if you consider that there are prophecies in the Prophet ﷺ, this again, taken in consideration with everything else, points to the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ. And finally, a careful study of the Prophet ﷺ's life, careful, critical, objective study of the Prophet ﷺ's life, I think will point anyone who studies it to realize that this person, if you analyze his life and consider what must have been his motives, he was not driven by seeking kingdom. He was not driven by seeking the dunya. He was not driven by seeking women, because all of these things he could have had, and he didn't. Yet he didn't seek them. And so, if you consider the life that he led, and you consider the outcome, if you consider the generation that he raised, the companions, and what he taught them, and the impact that they had on the world, all of this points to he must have been telling the truth. He must be what he says he is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the last and final messenger of the one and true and only God. And so all of this points to the truthfulness of the Prophet ﷺ and the truthfulness of the revelation that he was given. Now, with this said, if once this is established that there is a God and that he is one, and that Muhammad ﷺ is his last and final messenger, one of the most obvious and indisputable facts the Prophet ﷺ that brought this Quran. Now, I guess there are people who have tried in the modern era to cast doubt about this, to cast doubt about the source of the Quran, and to attribute to others than him. some even claiming that the text of the Quran continued to be developed perhaps for generations after the Prophet ﷺ until it reached the form that we have now. This claim is now not taken seriously even in the Western Academy, much less anywhere else. But the only real response that a claim like this deserves, the only academic response, or only intellectual response that someone making this sort of claim actually deserves, is to laugh in his face. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't make responses. But if we speak about the actual intellectual value of such a claim and the responses that it deserves, it doesn't deserve any more than we just simply laugh in their face. With that said, this basically then is the Quran is revelation, and this outline that I've given is just a glimpse. It's just a glimpse of how we go about, just basically bullet points of how we go about establishing that. Once that is established, then this establishes the Hujjiyah of the Quran. That then brings us to the discussion of the Hujjiyah of the Sunnah, which inshallah we will get to next week. Before I finish with a brief intro to the topic of Hujjiyah Sunnah, let me just say that it's very important, particularly in the time that we live. I know that this was a bit of a tangent that goes outside of the scope of usul fiqh, but there is a relationship to what we're discussing, and all of the ulum of the Sharia are intertwined and interdependent on one another. So, it's very important, particularly in the time that we are living in, to give focus to instilling in people, instilling in Muslims, a deep understanding of the fundamentals, the core principles and teachings of Islam, the core principles and teachings of the different sciences. And this process of instilling these core teachings, it should be based on careful and rigorous study of these topics in light of their evidences. The value of this, and this is important on two levels. Number one, it's important for laymen. Every Muslim, as a Muslim, should have a strong foundation. And it's even more important when dealing with tulab al-ilm, starting from when they're beginners, to instill in them these fundamentals, because it's these fundamentals then that they will build on. And oftentimes the way that we learn many things, we might learn them in considerable detail, while yet the fundamentals still remain unclear. And this applies to general Muslims, it applies to tulab al-ilm. Having a clear understanding of the fundamental principles of any topic, the essential core of any topic that has been arrived at based on careful contemplation and rigorous study, the value of this is that it gives you an interpretive framework to make sense of the details, that you're able to put it all together. You're able to take its topic, deconstruct it, and build it from the ground up. And in doing so, when you come across details, stray details that for someone else might cause confusion, for you they won't cause confusion because your foundation is strong. When your foundation is strong, these things that oftentimes easily confuse people or shake them, or will not shake you. It's important to note that also what can happen is sometimes we go through life where we have a particular framework that we use to filter information and analyze information. And if that framework is unsound, partially or in whole, when that framework is unsound, it might resist contradictory, might give us the ability to resist conflicting information up to a point. But eventually, if there's a flaw in that framework, the whole thing can unravel and collapse. And unfortunately, this is what happens to a lot of people who run into shubhat, run into doubts, is that either they have a foundation that is faulty, or they simply don't know much about these topics to begin with, and so it's very easy for them to be shaken. For someone who has a foundation, maybe that foundation is faulty, maybe it would sometimes be more difficult. But then when you poke holes in that foundation, eventually they realize that the foundation that they have, the framework that they have, has problems. It can collapse, and that can cause a crisis. It can cause an intellectual crisis or a spiritual crisis. La qaddar Allah. So it's very important to instill these fundamentals. Sheikh Hatim actually has a very important book on this. He has a new edition of it coming out now. It's known as, it's called al-Muhkamat. This is the old edition. He has a new edition of it coming out soon, where he talks about basically the need for this approach to strengthening the foundations of our Islam. Because when you have a strong foundation that gives you a big picture view of topics such as Iman and Kufr, or the transmission of the Qur'an, or the transmission of the Sunnah, or other aspects of the religion, and our understanding of the religion and the application of the religion. Individual arguments, even if you don't know the answer to them, they will not shake you, because you know that you have that this detail, you must have some answer that fits with this entire framework. And oftentimes you yourself will be able to deduce the answer from knowing these fundamental principles and understanding how this piece of information, how it fits with those fundamentals. So this is very important, and this is also part of why I wanted to go about doing this in this fashion. Next week, inshallah, we will discuss Hujjiyah Sunnah, and probably we'll take a look briefly at Ijma and Qiyas as well before actually jumping into Imam al-Juwayni's discussions on textual interpretation. Basically, with Hujjiyah Sunnah, there's two aspects of the discussion. One is the Hujjiyah, is the Sunnah Hujjah, and there are some who claim that that this idea that Sunnah is independent of, has some ability to, has some authority to as a legislative source in addition to the Quran, that this in fact goes against the Quran and the Quran. And so this idea, or this movement, oftentimes known as Quranists, who say that basically we follow the Quran only. And then there's a second element to this discussion, which is that some might admit in principle the authority of the Sunnah, but then limit that authority of the Sunnah by trying to limit the role of the Prophet ﷺ to some aspects rather than others, or by casting doubt on the reliability of the transmission of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, or casting doubt on the reliability of the methodology of the scholars, previous scholars of hadith, for assessing the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ that has been transmitted down to us. And so next week our discussion will focus more on Hujjiyat Sunnah than on the other aspect. As for the other aspect, which is the reliability of the transmission of the Sunnah, we've already actually done one course, on a book by Sheikh Hatim, al-Usul al-Aqliyah li'ulum al-Sunnah al-Nabawiyyah, that deals with an aspect of this topic. Hopefully, in the future, we'll have opportunity to do courses for general audience as well, or lecture series for general audience as well, dealing with this topic. But inshallah, we will wrap up with that and pick up next week. If you have any questions. Okay, so one question here. What are the Hanbali Maliki stances on the issue of Qawl al-Sahabi? Basically, the popular view for the Hanbali school and the Maliki school is also that Qawl al-Sahabi is a Hujjah. Any other questions? Okay. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد الله تعالى أعلم.